Three, two, one, begin.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on perspectives on sustainable transportation in Trinidad and Tobago. My name is Dr. Trevor Townsend. I'm the head of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Faculty of Engineering of UE. And this webinar is being presented in conjunction and in partnership with the Association of Professional Engineers of Trinidad and Tobago. So we are very pleased to have you with us this morning. We have a fairly packed program, but I think that you will find it very interesting. We have a multidisciplinary team of presenters who will be given different perspectives on sustainable transportation in Trinidad and Tobago, with, of course, implications for other Caribbean states and for the wider region. So that today we will have these presentations. I invite you, if you do have questions, that you place them in the chat. We will be having a short question and answer period after every presenter, but really at the end of the 4 presentations, we will have a longer time to chat, ask questions, and get clarification. So you're invited to place your questions in the chat as they come up, and we will try to get them answered for you during the course of this morning. Let me go right away to our first presenter. And before I do that, let me just thank in advance the Marketing and Communications Department of the university for its assistance in the hosting and arrangements for this webinar. So our first presenter is Engineer Kohan Dolsi, who is a recent graduate with distinction of our Masters in Civil Engineering program. And she'll be doing a presentation looking at the development of a sustainability framework for transportation in Trinidad and Tobago. So that I'm going to invite now Engineer Kohan Dolsi to unmute her mic and share her screen as we take in her presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Townsend. Good morning to all attendees. Today I share with you my work on the development of a transportation sustainability framework for Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, so when we look at sustainable transport, I took the approach of looking at all of the sustainable development goals that are associated with transportation. So we have here good health and well-being, that would be goal 3. Goal 7, affordable and clean energy. Goal 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure. Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities. Goal 12, responsible consumption and production. And goal 13, climate action. We'll also take a look here at Trinidad and Tobago, which is a twin island state. The major urban centers would be Port of Spain on the west coast, well, northwest coast, and San Fernando in the south. The major transportation links are along the east-west corridor and the north-south corridor, with sea and air transportation to the island of Tobago. So the transportation system of Trinidad and Tobago is fraught with a number of issues, which have been identified as ability of alternative fuels. We have a large and growing vehicle population, and also there's limited accessibility of alternative fuel vehicles. Some of the solutions that have been presented include the prioritization of short and long-term traffic and transportation plans. There's a need for established requirements for sustainable transport. There is need for sensitization on and high priority electric vehicles. There's also a norm about transportation and sustainability in Trinidad. One of the investments by the government has been the CNG, compressed natural gas, as a vehicular fuel. As at, well, in 2018, NGC CNG target of CNG vehicle conversions in the area of 17,500 conversions. That was over a 3 to 5 year period. However, when the research was carried out in mid 2019, we could only track about 5,300 vehicles being converted to CNG. So that would include buses, maxi taxis, taxis, and private cars. The dashed lines on the graph show 100, 300, and 500% projections of the 2019 values, and it shows a total of 15,000 conversions, which is still short of the 17,500 target for 2018. So whereas a lot of funds have been invested into CNG conversions, you find that the uptake has not been as impressive as anticipated. So some of the hindrances identified, that's with regards to sustainable urgent updating to address the current issues being experienced. There are conflicting roles as the transportation planning, the demand management, and public transit management are carried out disjointedly and are largely influenced by politics, economics, and traffic reduction. There's a need to define measurable performance indicators for monitoring and evaluation the transportation system as well as the sustainability of the system. And some recommendations were made by the Joint Select Committee for PTSD as far back as 2015, but those have not been adopted. There is a responsibility on the part of the population as they have grown accustomed to large subsidies from the government, and preserving resources is not necessarily a prime concern for the people. There is the priority bus route that is intended to prioritize public transport. However, there's limited access to maxi taxi drivers, but it remains accessible to a lot of single occupants. The road network is constantly being expanded, and while that more sustainable, and another hindrance is that the indicators for determining transport sustainability are not being measured, and it begs the question of whether they have been identified and also whose responsibility it is to collect the information as well as to monitor the system. And when you look at the verification aspect, constraints of data availability in effectively measuring the sustainability progress. And when a new project is identified or conceptualized, the cost of the project usually takes precedence over the sustainability effects. So a system be used to develop a framework using criteria that can be measured and evaluated using a balanced set of indicators that will reflect the system's objectives. Of course, the perspectives, the assumptions, and limitations of the framework must be understood by the user. And I try to adopt a series of national, regional, and internationally established indicators to develop the framework. That way, it would make it more applicable, and you would not have necessarily have to go far and beyond to obtain the data that is required for for the use of the framework. So the framework is impact based and also hierarchical, and it is based on the sustainability requirements of economy, environment, and society. So the of resources for input into the transportation system and the resulting outputs that could pose threats to human health and the environment. The social requirement explores the aspects of everyday living that can be affected by the operations within the transportation system. And this can also impact relationships among people and social institutions. So this is the transportation, road transportation sustainability sustainability framework. To transportation professionals via an electronic questionnaire, and their feedback was sought. The feedback was from the framework input, so all from national and international databases, some of which the data is available, others not so much, some have to be developed. So we see here that based on the professionals' feedback, the social requirement was rated the highest, as in it basically weighed half of the like it's half. Without it, you not leaning towards sustainability. So we had 50% on the social requirement, followed by the environmental, and then the economic. And under each of these, we had different criteria that would lean towards the requirements of that thing, and safety having 16.7%. Under the environmental requirement, pollution had the highest part to play, followed by energy efficiency and fuel price. So when we look at the various requirements and the criteria, the indicators that would the indicators that would like suggest that you are satisfying those criteria. For accessibility and mobility, we have access to public transportation, which is related to of the public transportation system, which would be measured by PTSC or other maxi taxi association. You have the use of AFVs as public transport, and also the use of non-motorized transport. When we speak to safety, you'd look at items like the death rate due to traffic, DG3, the accident non-motorized transport. Technology acceptance was not shown as a criteria in the framework initially because it did not receive the consensus of the professionals. However, the indicator for the technology acceptance, which is the payback period, received consensus and therefore had to be brought back into the framework. The environmental indicators, we have pollution playing a major role here, and you would measure by means of motorization value, which is basically a ratio of the number of vehicles to the number of inhabitants in the country. You'd also look at the air quality, which is related to SDG 7. Energy efficiency, the indicators would be investments in energy efficiency and energy intensity, which is SDG 7, and energy source, which speaks to the renewable energy share, and again is related to SDG 7. Economic indicators, infrastructure played a major role, and some of the indicators here would be reliability related to SDG 7, the vehicle to refueling station index, and also the refueling station density. And these would relate to both conventional and alternative fuels. The market health indicators would be the average earnings related to SDG 8. You could also look at alternative fuel investments by the government, as well as household expenditure on transport. And fuel price would be monitored by fuel subsidies in relation to SDG 12, as well as the alternative fuel price ratio. Basically, a comparison of the price of the alternative fuels to the conventional fuels. So I've mentioned all of the indicators. So I pulled out a few here to just show the progress. Well, for those for which the data was available. So if we look at AFVs in public transport, the description here would be proportion of AFVs belonging to the population of vehicles providing public transport. And in 2018, it was 0.13% in 2017, which was pretty low. The death rate due to road traffic injuries, 5.9%. From 2016 to 20 is more or less stable and rounds off to 8 road traffic injuries per 1,000 persons or 1,000 inhabitants. So these were all motorization value, rate of vehicles to inhabitants, based on the data provided by Ministry of Works. The motorization value was for in 2017. No data was available for 2018, but we see that the values don't change here much. Investments in energy efficiency, the value was at 50.5% in 2016, but has decreased drastically. Well, had decreased drastically up until 2018. When you look at the renewable energy share, it was at 0.3% in 2018, which is pretty low, especially that the country should be producing by say 2021 or 2025. The economic indicators here, we have the ratio of AFVs to the number of alternative fuel refueling stations, also known as the vehicle refueling station index. So for CNG, that ratio was 0.67 in 2018. And the literature has shown that the optimal value is 1. You trying to exceed the minimum value of zero point 0.2, but you don't want to exceed the maximum value in the range of 1.1 to 1.3. So what's been happening with alternative vehicle up want to have too much infrastructure such that you don't have like say vehicles to use them, but at the same time persons would be reluctant to purchase a vehicle if there's not enough infrastructure to support it. So they refer to that as the chicken and egg conundrum. Some of you may have heard. You look at the refueling station density as well stations to gasoline refueling stations. And for CNG in 2018, that value was 0.08. And for electric vehicles, 0.029. So the recommendation is that your minimum value should be between 0.1 and 0.2. And we see that in 2018, Trinidad was way below that for the electric vehicles and fairly close to 1 in for the CNG vehicles. And the other economic indicator there would be to look at the ratio of the price of the alternative fuel to the price of the conventional fuel. And the recommendation is that the CNG should be 40 to 60% lower than the price of the CNG should be 40 to 60% lower than gasoline, but you see 80% lower than gasoline. Similarly, it was up to 71% lower than diesel, and the recommendation is 70%. So whereas the fuel prices have been pretty good with respect to the recommendations, the uptick has not been as successful. The last two rows here look at the price of the electric vehicle as compared to both gasoline and diesel. So you see that the electricity price is, say, 90% lower than gasoline and 92% or 91% lower than diesel. So in summary, the framework has 3 requirements, 9 criteria, and 22 indicators. It is intended for use by policymakers and planners, both locally and internationally, for the purpose of measuring, reporting, and monitoring sustainability progress in the transportation system. And each AHP structure allows for modeling and multi-criteria decision-making applications. So some of the potential applications, these also came from the transportation professionals when we sought feedback from them on the framework, was determining the overall status of the transportation system with respect to sustainability, setting targets for improvements to the transportation system, assessing the suitability of proposed alternatives, and also making decisions about investments in the transport sector. So in conclusion, the 22 indicators can be evaluated to explore the effects of emerging policy and plan projects on the sustainability of the system, the transportation system. The framework can be used primarily as a guide in informing of the requirements for the sustainability of the transportation system. And it can also play an integral role in the evaluation of alternative solutions to transportation history of works and transport. There have been quite a few recommendations which I think are valid and they should continue to work on. That would be data collection, research and development programs through partnerships with the University of the West Indies and other government ministries and transport associations. Behavioral change on the part of the people, as well as support for the sustainable initiatives or sustainable transport initiatives via political efforts. There should be public transportation services. There has been a recommendation for intra-city transit to reduce the number of vehicles within the city center and also to encourage cleaner fuels to be used in the cities, and also a call for energy efficiency and renewable energy. But in addition to these, there should also be vehicle develop electric vehicle penetration, as that is one of the things, well, this that would help, or it would go part and parcel with the energy efficiency and renewable energy this framework presented here today can also be used for quantitative feedback on service can be revised to sustainability. Me, I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Engineer Dulcie. All right, so before we move on to the next presenter, we have two questions for you. We will just go with two questions now and then save the rest of the questions for the end. We'll save the rest of the questions for the end, where we have a longer Q&A session. So the first question for you, Engineer Dulcie, is what is the main reason why CNG has not caught on in Trinidad?
Okay, so there are quite a few reasons, but one of them is really the acceptance of the new technology, in that persons want to hear other person's success stories before they move on to it. Of course, there's a cost associated with it, although not high in terms of conversions, but there is a cost associated with it. People would think twice. In addition to that, there was also a safety concern at some point. And since you asked the question, I feel that some of the hindrances to CNG adoption, those that persons perceive, have been addressed, but the information is not out there and persons are not aware that they have been addressed. And as such, it takes a little more time for the uptick to materialize.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question we have here is, can this framework be applied to other Caribbean countries?
Yes, definitely. The framework can be applied to any small island developing states. One of the challenges I found in developing it is really the availability of information, because most of the values that I presented for the indicators were values that were obtained from the UN Sustainable Development Goal database. A lot of the information was not available within Trinidad itself, and the situation would would be a lot worse in some of the smaller islands where data collection is not one of the strategies towards obtaining the data that is required.
Okay, thank you very much, Engineer Dulcie. Now I'll turn back over to Dr. Townsend, who will introduce, sorry, our next presenter.
Thank you very much, Kohan and Nicola. And Kohan, that was a very interesting project you did in terms of developing that framework. And you did point out to some of the issues which we are going to be touching on later on. And indeed, I want to introduce our next speaker, who is lecturer and coordinator of the MMERC at the Department of Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering at the Faculty of Engineering in the UWI. And he is Dr. Graham King. And Dr. King will speak about the economics and energy efficiency of e-mobility. So Graham, if you can, I see you are already showing your video. You can share your screen and over to Dr. Graham King.
Thank you, Dr. Townsend. Good morning, everybody. I'm very glad that you were able to attend. Welcome. So I'm gonna, as Dr. Townsend said, I'm gonna look at the energy and economic aspects of e-mobility, of electrification of the transport system. And just to start out really, to comment on the fact that there's very aggressive trends taking place in e-mobility and in electrification right now. I read two articles this morning when I got up. One was in maybe Forbes, I think, saying that Elon Musk has now overtaken Bill Gates as being the wealthiest, second wealthiest man in the world after Jeff Bezos. Why is this? Because his stock in Tesla, the electric vehicle company, has grown by $100 billion in value during the course of 2020, since January. So from January to now, his net worth has increased by $100 billion, which is absolutely phenomenal. And that is purely off the back, or let's say largely, the vast majority of it is off the back of electrification and electric vehicle growth. Of course, he's a massive pioneer, entrepreneur in that area. If we look at the global profile in this graphic, which I lifted from Deloitte, you could see the projection going forward and the projection of growth of market share of battery electric vehicles and plug-in vehicles towards 2030, 10 years from now, looking at around 30% penetration globally. Again, this is a sort of phenomenal growth rate in something that where the technology is so expensive to the consumer and to the end user. Very, very high value item when we're talking about vehicles, and therefore it's not as you know, it's not such a readily accessible consumer product like a phone or something like that, where it's much cheaper and more accessible. So to see this kind of rate of change of technology or penetration of technology is a phenomenon. And you can see on the top of the curve here, the growth in the proportion of global battery electric and plug-in electric vehicles. So these are vehicles which actually draw current from the electrical grid or from some kind of off-grid charging system. So that is being driven very aggressively. The other article I read was in Financial Times, and they were talking about the EV bubble. Remember a few years ago we had the dot-com bubble, and we have the you know, various sort of technology companies growing rapidly in value. Well, right now we're in the midst of an EV bubble. So these things are going very quickly globally. And the factors driving this swing to battery electric vehicles, there are a number of factors, one of which is consumer sentiment. People have now, electric vehicles have become aspirational, and lots of high-end iconic vehicles have come on the market in the last 10 years or so, which have drawn people strongly into this electric vehicle segment. That's being supported by policy and regulation around the world, by governments. In particular, it's also being supported now, and this is something that's changed significantly in the last 2 years, is OEM strategy. And the if you like, the narrative being put forward by the established vehicle makers has shifted massively in the last 2 years. And corporations and that being sort of the decision-making by large-scale corporations. For instance, Amazon has ordered 100,000 vehicles, electric vehicles from Rivian, or in partnership with Rivian. That's one of the startups. That's delivery vehicles to be used in the States. So that's a sort of example of a corporation driving hard after electrification of their fleet. This is another graph just to sort of underscore that point really. This is from IEA, and this is showing the global stock that's likely to be in place by 2030 from where it is today to 2019. Sort of expecting that we might get up close to 250 million electric vehicles on the road of different types by 2030. So the growth rates are just phenomenal. This is a global phenomenon, and this sort of provides some context to our discussion and our discourse in electric mobility for our region. So some of the policy and regulation aspects of e-mobility trends. So this is what our government's doing. 17 countries have plans, and these are substantial developed countries have planned to ban the sales of ICE vehicles by 2030 to 2040. And last 2 weeks, the UK just brought their ban forward to 2030. So in 10 years' time, no more vehicles, no more ICE, that's internal combustion engine or typical electric, gas, diesel, and even natural gas vehicles will be sold in the UK from 2030. And there are 17 countries that have put similar bans or proposed bans in place. Many national governments and regional governments are offering substantial incentives to the purchase of electric vehicles and the installation of home chargers. And this could be in the form of reduced taxation or cashback. The cashback schemes giving up to sort of $8,000 US towards the cost of a vehicle. And that's necessary because at this point in time, at this end of the kind of growth curve, electric vehicles are still not cost competitive with an equivalent internal combustion engine at point of purchase. It is cost competitive as you go through the life cycle, but we'll look at that in just a minute. And China's a big player here. China is the largest market for electric vehicles. It's also the largest producer of electric vehicles, and the Chinese government has aggressively incentivized this establishment of electric vehicle startups and aggressively incentivize the sort of matched sales of electric vehicles through various incentives. So that's on the government side. On this side, we're just looking at two of these sort of drivers in the e-mobility growth. From the OEM or from that's the vehicle manufacturers side of things. And we're talking here more about the traditional manufacturers that would have a very established track record of internal combustion engine vehicles, not the electric vehicle startup companies. But we are seeing a proliferation of new entrants into the market. BMW is going to be electrifying more than 30 models in the next 5 years. So that means if you kind of think about how that rollout is going to be of new models, if it's 30 models by 2025, that's just in basically, say 5 years' time. That means that they have to be at least delivering 6 new electric vehicles onto the market every year from now forward. And that's also is in the context of the fact they have about 3 vehicles at present, electric vehicles. So a very aggressive growth in the production of electric vehicles. Honda, a popular one here in Trinidad. All mainstream European vehicles will only be electric by 2022. So from 2022, Honda will no longer be selling internal combustion engine vehicles. That's the year after next. Well, in a few weeks' time, we could say next year, right? They brought that forward, that target. And Honda was not, well, they've been a reasonable advocate of electric vehicles, actually. Yes. They've had some electric vehicles around for a while, but they've not been driving as aggressively as this. And then General Motors also announced recently that it's going to bring 30 new electric vehicles to the market in the next 5 years. So they're on track with BMW in that respect. So you can see how powerfully trending this is. a report on the Caribbean region and electrification in the Caribbean region by from IADB and OAS. This is Fasidi and et al. They identified reasons why the Caribbean is suitable for the rollout of electric vehicles and e-mobility generally, because we're dependent on costly oil and fuel imports. Trinidad, of course, was not historically in this situation because we had our own refinery, but we don't anymore. So we now are also in the situation of being a fuel importer, even though we're an oil exporter. Transport sectors account for a large proportion of energy use. Again, less so in Trinidad, but very much so in the rest of the Caribbean. But our energy use in transport is huge. It's just that we have an even huger use of energy in the industrial and domestic sectors, but it is still a very large chunk of our energy use in Trinidad. We have abundant potential for renewable energy, of course, in the region due to our climate. And our nations are small, meaning that range limitations are really not a concern like they are. You know, there's a major holdback in a lot of larger territories is that people are afraid or concerned about the fact they might run out of power and not be near a charging station because the infrastructure is not as developed as a traditional gas station network. Let's look at Trinidad, kind of zooming into TNT in particular. Well, from the point of view of looking at it, I titled the presentation, The Energy and Economics of EVs, but I've added sustainability, especially after Kohan's presentation just now. So energy-wise, we have committed to a 15% CO2 reduction by 2030, and the strategy has 30% reduction of CO2 in transportation. I'm going to come back to that because that's a very challenging target. In terms of energy, we have non-competitive oil reserves. We are an exporter, but we are losing our competitiveness in the realm of export of oil. And we have, of course, gas. We're a big gas exporter, but our gas reserves are depleting. And of course, I mentioned before, we're now importing all our vehicle fuel. So that's the energy side in Trinidad. On the economic side, we're very constrained financially in terms of our foreign exchange. And this affects both vehicle imports and now fuel imports, which are paid for in US dollars. And on the sustainability side, we have traffic congestion, very, very big problem, and probably not discussed as much as I thought it would have been, you know, nationally. And also associated with that is localized air pollution. Things have improved a bit in the last 10 years. I did a good bit of work on localized air pollution maybe about 10 years ago, and showed that the, if you like, the corridors around the major arteries, the major vehicle highways were almost twice the levels, maximum levels recommended of certain pollutants that are recommended by the WHO. So we do have a localized pollution problem as well. So our, you know, some of the work I'm presenting here, just what we did, I'm working with Bhupendra Maharaj, who's one of my PhD students, and Bhupendra and I worked on determining, looking at the suitability of electric vehicles for Trinidad. We looked in our work specifically at passenger cars. And to do this, we determined the representative driving characteristics in Trinidad, recognizing every market is different. Every market has slightly different characteristics to understand the true economic and energy impact, and even things like range. We'd need to understand what the actual driving characteristics are here. So we derived or obtained driving cycles, and we use those driving cycles. That's basically a kind of representation of what a typical trip is like in terms of speed versus time. And drive cycles are used all around the world to quantify fuel consumption or fuel economy in vehicles. There are a set of standard drive cycles, but more and more the issue of real world driving being different from the standardized drive cycles that are used to predict fuel economy is becoming an issue, and more the development of specific drive cycles for specific territories or contexts has become important. So we developed a drive cycle for Trinidad. We think that's the first time anybody's done that. So we now have that at least for kind of passenger cars. And we performed some analysis as well of the life cycle cost of ownership. So we could determine what's the relative cost to the consumer, to the user, of running an electric vehicle over a period of time versus running a gasoline vehicle in this case, and we can extend it to diesel as well. So this is our drive cycle. It's actually made up of two parts. One is the suburban, and this is sort of driving in traffic, driving around town or in the neighborhood. And you can see this is sort of characteristic here, looks like a random squiggly line. But this is actually has been built up by taking a large quantity of driving data, of logging data of typical drives, using different methods and different routes and so forth, and then breaking those data down into microtrips and microtrips, not microchips, microtrips, or very small segments, and patching them back together. And there are mathematical methods for doing this, which are fairly reasonably standardized, and we follow some of those mathematical methods. So this should be a fairly robust drive cycle for the suburban environment and likewise for the highway. And I think that the whole drive cycle, when you put both parts together, it comes to about 26 kilometers of driving altogether. So when we run this through a model, and what we did is we did both physical, well, we acquired a lot of data from actual vehicles, an electric vehicle and a gasoline vehicle, and we used those data to verify a model that we built, a simulation model. So we got a level of confidence that our simulation model is accurate. And then we used the drive cycles that we just put together, ran our simulated vehicles through those drive cycles to determine energy consumption over those drive cycles. And these are the results. For the gasoline vehicle, this is the amount of gasoline that was used, 1.46 liters. For the highway, 0.72 for the suburban, altogether just over 2 liters of gasoline. That converts to 19.4 kilowatt hours. So we're putting everything in kilowatt hours because that's easier to do with from an electricity point of view. So we've converted our gasoline liters into an energy quantity, kilowatt hours. And if we can, and that gives us, for the gasoline vehicle, a usage of 0.72 kilowatt hours per kilometer. So when we run our battery electric vehicle through exactly the same drive cycle, no surprises, it's a lot more efficient, and it comes up to be 3.87 kilowatt hours of energy used, and that gives us an efficiency of 0.14 kilowatt hours per kilometer. So on the face of it, you can see that the battery electric vehicle is 80% more efficient than our gasoline vehicle in terms of energy use for the same drive cycle. And of course, energy use does relate back to carbon dioxide emissions as well, which is a big deal. Of course, a concern still is, or a consideration is, how far can you drive these vehicles on a single tank or a full battery? And the energy storage capacity of the gasoline vehicle is 431 kilowatt hours. So that shows how dense or how energy dense gasoline is, and diesel is even more energy dense actually. So when you're driving your car around, that's one of the challenges with battery electric vehicle implementation, that to get that level of energy density into a battery is almost impossible, or has been so far. Our battery electric vehicle actually only has 28 kilowatt hours of onboard storage. Our efficiency, as we determined in the last slide, the efficiency is shown here. So just a vision, you get the kilometer range for each vehicle, about 600 kilometers for the gasoline vehicle, and 200 for the battery electric vehicle. This is again over our specified drive cycle. Now 200 kilometers seems like it's a lot less. Of course, it's 1/3 of the gasoline's range, but when you consider that a 200 kilometer range, how many of us have driven more than 200 kilometers in a day in Trinidad in recent times? I mean, it's very unusual. I think only a few users of vehicles would go more than 200 kilometers in a day in Trinidad. And that might be an exceptional drive rather than a regular. drive. I mean, if you're a delivery driver or something, maybe, but that's more than adequate for almost all daily drive. So that takes out of the equation the issue of having to have a very large infrastructure of charging or a large charging network, which is a massive infrastructural cost for the deployment of e-mobility in other territories. This is for passenger cars. If we're talking about commercial vehicles, if we're talking about buses, then yes, there will definitely be a consideration of infrastructure requirements to allow for normal usage of these vehicles, right? So infrastructure is still an issue for the larger vehicles, but for passenger cars, individual use, not a consideration, to be honest. Let's look at the cost of ownership for the internal combustion engine. This is for a small passenger car. This is, I think, the ICE vehicle was a Hyundai Elantra, and it was compared with a Hyundai Ioniq battery electric vehicle. And this is on a time frame or an ownership of 5 years and 90,000 kilometers. So we have here the purchase price and assumed capital depreciation. This is a bit of a fudge factor because we don't know exactly what the depreciation would be, but we're assuming a larger depreciation for the battery electric vehicle, partly because after 5 years, there might be some nervousness about the state of the batteries, and the batteries would, of course, be something that might require to be changed and would be a high value change. They can be changed. In fact, most vehicles, you can change individual cells, and I did diagnose which cells in the battery need to be changed, so it doesn't have to be as costly as buying an entire battery pack. But that will have an impact, we think, on the depreciation of the vehicle. This is the energy cost here between the two. That's where a big difference comes due to the much more efficient operation of a battery electric vehicle. These are the maintenance costs. Again, much lower for a battery electric vehicle. In fact, this is probably a little higher than I would have. I think in the next slide, I've made a lower assumption for maintenance costs. Basically, a battery electric vehicle would be half the maintenance cost of a gasoline vehicle, and probably more than half. In other words, let me say less than half the cost for a diesel. Diesels are more expensive to maintain on the whole. So when we do the cumulative costs of the depreciation, energy, and maintenance, this is what we get for each case. And there we see the total cost of ownership for the battery electric vehicle, despite the fact it was a higher purchase price, comes out to be a good bit lower per kilometer. So you're saving money in the long run. So I've done the same analysis here, but now what I've done is I've incorporated the fact that our government has decided that the waiver that was previously in place for low emissions vehicles, for battery electric vehicles, is going to be removed. So from Christmas, or rather from 2021 onwards, anybody who buys a battery electric vehicle will be paying a regular level of duties and VAT and motor vehicle tax. Motor vehicle tax is lower for battery electric vehicles still. So I've done a similar comparison on the cost of a small SUV. This is the CIF price. This is not the price, the sticker price in the dealer, but we can see the comparison. The battery electric vehicle now jumps to being about $100,000 more expensive. That shows the difference in an equivalent vehicle, a battery electric still being much more expensive. That's going to come down in time, but right now that's where we're at. After applying the relevant duties and taxes for assuming a 2-litre ICE vehicle and a battery electric vehicle with a 110 kilowatt motor, these are our duties and taxes. Again, same lifetime fuel cost analysis. This is the service analysis. Assumed depreciation, again, a bit more on the battery electric vehicle. So the total costs here actually still are in the favor of the battery electric vehicle, even with the duties, MVT, and tax added back in. And over, well, I changed the time frame. So 8 years now and 160,000 kilometers. So payback is going to be a bit longer, but we are still seeing a benefit to the battery electric vehicle over that time frame. And of course, if we look at the CO2 consumed, then the battery electric vehicle is again much more beneficial to the environment and to our targets there. In terms of the foreign exchange, which is also an issue, slightly more on the side of the battery electric, but not significantly more. So that's just where things are at now. I'll be quick because I realize time is running a bit short, but let me do a well-to-wheel analysis here. So this is looking at the energy use, not just to, the analysis so far has been looking at the battery, electric vehicle, gasoline vehicle in its normal operation. So assuming the energy is on board, how efficient is the vehicle running? But in reality, if you want to get a picture of the energy consumption on a national level, then you have to do something called well-to-wheel. So you're looking at the use of energy from the origin, which is in the ground, if it's a fossil fuel or if it's a renewable energy at source, and looking at the carbon dioxide and energy consumption for that whole process up until the point where it creates motion in the vehicle, right? So we used our same simulation and drive cycle analysis to do some well-to-wheel analysis, and this is what we found. When we did that, of course, the tank to wheel, which is the onboard part, the gasoline vehicle, we already saw is a lot less efficient than the battery electric vehicle, but getting the energy to the gasoline vehicle is more efficient. So there's 0.12 kilowatt hours per kilometer for a gasoline vehicle. And again, this is using our drive cycle distance. The battery electric vehicle takes a bit more. It's about 0.3 kilowatt hours per kilometer for that battery electric vehicle. Why? Because your electricity in Trinidad is being produced in a fossil fuel plant, so you still have the losses there in the gas turbines. You also have some transmission losses, getting it to your charging point, and then charging itself has about an 88% efficiency. So you lose a bit of energy just through heat loss as the vehicle is charging. But still, you know, well-to-wheel is still looking at energy of about half per kilometer for the battery electric vehicle. That translates into even more than a half reduction in our CO2 because gasoline, well, natural gas is the source of our electricity. Natural gas has a lower carbon footprint than gasoline if you burn the equivalent amount of gasoline. So we see that there's a 54% reduction in CO2 per kilometer in the use of our battery electric vehicle. So I noticed that Curtis Mohammed is on, a very good friend from NGC CNG. This is where he ceased to be a good friend of mine because I'm about to talk about CNG vehicles and the well-to-wheel analysis for CNG. I've actually just lifted this directly from this paper here. So this is the reference Curran et al. From Energy. And they do a nice little analysis where they look at the well-to-wheel for this would be a CNG vehicle versus an electric vehicle that uses natural gas as the energy source. So this is exactly our context in Trinidad. Compression loss, so you have 5% loss in compression of the gas. But then, of course, the major efficiency loss is that you're still running an internal combustion engine, and the efficiency of a gas vehicle, not too far off a petrol vehicle, actually maybe slightly lower than a petrol vehicle, or certainly lower than a diesel vehicle. So the well-to-wheel efficiency is about 11 to 22%, depending on the efficiency of your vehicle primarily. If you do the same analysis, you know, this is what we did already with our electric vehicle, the overall efficiency is basically about double or twice, it's twice as efficient as a natural gas vehicle, using natural gas as the fossil fuel source of energy. So you're using the same number of gas molecules, put it through an electric vehicle, you're going to use half the number of molecules to go the same distance. And this is going to be affected by the gas mileage or the fuel consumption of the vehicle, the gas vehicle. And this is just showing the well-to-wheel, assuming about 35 miles per gallon. Then this shows us what the well-to-wheel energy in red and greenhouse gases in blue will be, right? And this is the electric vehicle equivalent. So last couple of slides, looking for a 30% reduction in CO2 in the transport sector by 2030. This is how ambitious this is. If we were to rely on introducing electric vehicles to achieve our goal, of 30% CO2 reduction, you'd have to have a 55% penetration of electric vehicles to meet that target. Assuming that we have the same number of registered vehicles on the roads, that means we're not getting any more vehicles than we have now, which is also kind of unrealistic. That means that an average of 6% of the existing vehicle fleet would have to be registered annually. So if we have 800,000 vehicles on the road, someone asked that question, how many vehicles do we have? I think maybe 700,000 to 800,000 running vehicles. Then if we have that many, we'd have to have about 44,000 battery electric vehicles registered on average, 45,000 per annum. That's a lot. That's a huge number of electric vehicles. And it means that every time you register an electric vehicle, you have to scrap an internal combustion engine vehicle and take it off the roads to ensure that that fleet doesn't grow over time. If we assume an annual average household mileage of 17,800 kilometers, which we got from survey results, this is what our chart would look like. I mean, this is just assuming that we're relying on electrification of the fleet, right? So our reduction in CO2 is the black line, and it's on the right-hand scale, goes up to about 30% by 2030. But to get that, we have to register all these electric vehicles. So we've got to, over half of our electric vehicles registered in 2030 are electric. This is what I think is a more realistic projection. And this is showing a kind of exponential growth over years in the battery electric registrations. And also we're seeing the top of this curve is gradually growing. That's showing that there is a growth in the total vehicle fleet, which I think is also realistic. But we're seeing a slowing growth in internal combustion engines. This could only be achieved by a very aggressive incentivization of battery electric vehicles, I think, by the government. So this is where the government has to act. But unfortunately, even with this acting, the transport CO2 ends up at about 6% reduced from where we're at today. So we have to be even more aggressive, and that's assuming we're getting to like 95% of all vehicles by 2030 sold in Trinidad are battery electric vehicles. So we've got to look at these data in more detail, and this is where the need for transport policy comes in. Here are my conclusions. I think most of these things we covered already. So instead of just reiterating, I think this last point here, this points to the urgent need to have a national transport policy that goes well beyond private vehicles or individual vehicles. And in order to achieve our Paris objectives, the electrification of transport is highly desirable because it is so much more energy efficient. It mitigates carbon emissions. It has very low emissions, which was one of the factors in Ms. Dulce's framework. It also reduces noise, but it has to go beyond cars and vans. It has to be part of an integrated transport system and transport policy. That has to include e-bikes. They'd be very suitable for Trinidad. You could get to work without being sweaty in about half the time you're sitting in the traffic if you're commuting to Port of Spain, right? So e-bikes, mopeds and motorbikes, buses, heavy goods vehicles, you have to look at all these and look towards electrification. And also probably for these heavy vehicles, also some CNG as well, just to appease Curtis and to agree with him on those. Conversions might be part of that as opposed to just new vehicle sales. So that's my presentation. Apologies for running a couple of minutes over there. Open for questions.
Thanks a lot, Graham. Because we won't have any time for questions at this stage because you're going to be running into a time problem. So we're going to have to, I know there are many questions for Graham, but we're going to have to hold those until the plenary session. So that I'm going to ask Dr. Sanjay Bahadur Singh to start to line up his presentation. Sanjay is Senior Lecturer in Electrical and Computer Engineering, as well as a Deputy Dean, Enterprise Development and Outreach of the Faculty of Engineering. And he's going to be speaking about e-mobility and the grid. So that let's hear, he's already starting to share screen, Dr. Sanjay Bahadur Singh. Thank you very much, Sanjay.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Good morning, everyone. Trevor, just confirm that you are seeing my screen and you can hear me clearly.
Hear you loud and clear.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And we're going to talk a bit today about e-mobility and the grid, which is essentially transportation 2.0. So just as a definition, just to recap, I'm sure everyone on this webinar already has a fairly good appreciation, but I like to do it anyway. According to the NFPA 2017, an e-vehicle, by definition, and I've highlighted in red, primarily powered by an electric motor that draws current from a rechargeable storage battery, fuel cell, PV array, or another source of electric current. And given that we're going to talk about the grid today, I think it's critical to define that for us within context. And as Dr. King mentioned, China remains ahead of the game in terms of its uptake on EVs, and that is definitely setting the trend globally. So let's get straight into it here. The next generation utility. EVs, as we've just seen from the presentation before, will decrease the greenhouse gas emissions. They produce, I think Graham quoted 54% from that analysis less, but I can definitely say with confidence that at least 45, depending on the type of vehicle that you analyze. What this means is essentially going to have an increase in the demand for power. This will give the utilities the opportunity to grow, and it will also allow the opportunity to install more efficient plants that would further decrease its heat rate and therefore further decrease the greenhouse gas emission again. So it provides us with a good opportunity, given that natural gas generated cost per kilometer are roughly about 1/4 to 1/3 the cost of the gasoline, which we just saw in the example that Dr. King produced. So in all, this will encourage the adoption of EVs, will encourage the reduction of the GHGs. And then, of course, just look at this diagram here that Nissan had provided, which I think is very critical. First, identify that we can have the next generation customer. So what this provides us, V2G, which is vehicle to grid, is the opportunity where a vehicle owner, an electric vehicle owner, will have the opportunity to provide power back to the grid at some point in time, whether it be a short duration, a long duration, but most importantly, it allows the EV to actively contribute to the stability of the power system that we experience. Should it be a small outage, sustainable outage, whatever the case is, the EV is a moving battery. So it can eventually be harnessed to provide some measure of power back to the grid one day, particularly given that we have renewable energy resources that we can capitalize on, which can also be off-grid. So looking at EV charging, there's key thing that I wanted to bring to your attention here is this table in the right-hand box. We often hear about level 1, level 2, level 3, but I just wanted to highlight to everyone that the levels are indicative of the power consumption, that we have level 1, level 2, level 3 for both AC and DC. So please bear that in mind. There's often this misnomer when you talk about level 1 versus level 2, only relating to AC. We can have it at DC as well. So please bear that in mind. What you would expect for a residential system, which is installed at your homes, would be typically a level 1 AC, and in some cases, a level 2. This is at home. What is very useful here is that this provides us with the opportunity to charge our vehicles without going to the gas station, just as Dr. King has said. And given that there's, from his driving analysis, 200 kilometers is fairly sufficient for most of our commuters, the convenience of having to charge at home, well, that's something that we would all welcome. So I decided to take the opportunity to look at it, and this may be very controversial here, because I've included money. Given that I've used a figure here of 37 cents per kilowatt hour, I'm going to look at this holistically here to paint it in context of the demands on the grid. So if I were to take $20, I could potentially get 54 kilowatt hours of energy. This is as a residential customer. That would mean I could run my 12,000 BTU AC for 15 hours. If you sleep 5 hours a night, that's 3 nights. If you have the luxury of sleeping more than 5 hours a night, well, of course, it will be less time. That translates roughly into about 463 kilometers, which is the equivalent of 8 single trips from Port of Spain to San Fernando on what I would say is a relatively conservative driving mode. So to put it into perspective, if you were to pay for more electricity, you can now have $20 of electricity at this point in time, that is subject to change, can give you at least 8 trips, single trips. So now this will definitely have an impact on the grid. It will have an impact because as a consumer, you're going to perhaps be utilizing this option of transport a bit more, as well as you're going to utilize more energy from the system. But the classic case comes in, the chicken and the egg. Do we need to have the charging infrastructure in place? And of course, ample charging infrastructure will encourage the adoption of electric vehicles. It will also reduce the range anxiety that's shared across the board for all EV users, particularly if you're in large states. But fortunately, we are on an island, and the typical driving patterns and the range required will be a lot less. So given that EVs offer a solution for the personal transportation needs, it is expected to impact on the grid. Given that the utility as well is the only legally allowed entity to sell energy, we now have a scenario where the majority of the chargers will be installed residentially. Now, perhaps this may change in the future, and there are other ways in which people have been cleverly moving along that path to offer the service of charging. And factoring that in mind, the charging infrastructure still needs to be something that we need to have a good appreciation of. But having a charging infrastructure also means that we need to have a strong grid to support it, particularly given that at this point in time, we do not have a time of use tariff. And without a time of use tariff, the only influential perspective here is your convenience of charging, charge when you want, which can lead us to a different type of challenge, one where we enter the realm of uncoordinated charging. So uncoordinated charging could potentially bring us to a position where we have greater peaks in our system and lower lows. That is not good. And it's something that we'll touch about later because it reduces the efficiency of your system and also increases the cost. And the cost and efficiency I'm referring to is the cost of producing electrical energy and transporting that electrical energy to its end-use product. So I wanted to bring you all up to date in terms of what do we understand and how does this uncoordinated EV charging impact us all. So what I've captured here would be, this is a case study done in the United Kingdom from 2013 to 2015. The details are there via that link. And on the left side, what you actually get an appreciation of is the geographical layout of this little system, 6 feeders. But most importantly, on the right side of the graph, the right side graph, you see that I've created 2 circles. We have 2 little circles in blue. And what is important here to recognize is the limiting factor as the growth of EVs continues will definitely be that transformer that feeds the eventual customers. So in this particular case, an EV penetration level of 40% led to the limit of the transformer being reached. Now, if you have 40% penetration level, one might argue that's sufficient, but it all goes back to what capacity you have installed and other design metrics that can quantify that penetration level in terms of your total load. But the transformer would hit its limit first. Moving further down to the right-hand side, you'll see at about 90% penetration, that is where you're going to have the feeders potentially reaching their maximum capacity. Why is this important? This is important simply for us to have an appreciation that your transformer, as the first asset that will be coordinating with all your feeders, will definitely be a part where all the energy has to pass through, and therefore you most likely will see a bottleneck there first. And therefore, from an asset utilization perspective, you are potentially going to have peaks that may violate that condition. You don't want that, because then you probably will have to invest in upgrading the assets on your network. All this because everyone decides to come home and charge at the same time. So let's look at another example. And in this example, this is based in Hungary. What these fellas here did, this team I should say, what they did was they looked at delaying the charging. So the graph on the left identifies that they had uncoordinating charging, and you could see that there's, as the penetration increased, which is the dotted lines, there was an increase in the overall loading of the transformer. And in most cases here, it got up to just past 100% at 60% penetration. What is important for us to recognize is if that is shifted, meaning that charging pattern is shifted, we now have the opportunity to allow a greater level of penetration because we have not hit the capacity of our transformers. So therefore, the uncoordinated EV charging presents us with an optimization problem, an optimization of the existing assets, and how we can ensure we maximize the utilization of those assets. Ideally, we would like to have all assets being utilized for a high utilization level for a greater period of time. And that's the objective of this exercise. So the impacts will essentially lead to voltage fluctuations and violations. If we don't look at this carefully, we will have reduced system efficiency from a production of electrical energy that's being transmitted across, because we now have greater swings. We have higher highs and lower lows, which also leads to the possibility that we may eventually have some blackouts because we are overloading our network. So some solutions that we can explore, and I say we in terms of the regional context, would be time of use tariffs and coordinating charging. Time of use tariff, just looking at an example that I've extracted here from the US, we have to be careful of rebound charging. And time of use tariffs gives us an appreciation that if the rate is low, it can incentivize the consumer consumption. However, the residential versus the EV charging profiles provided a slightly different perspective, because people typically charge at late hours in the night. What you have is a maximization of that off-peak period for charging. So what these graphs highlight to us is that the advantage of utilizing a time of use tariff, depending on what those values are, may offer an improvement in the consumption, but financially, because people are limited to charging at home, may not allow much more advantage. So that's something that has to be looked at holistically. And then, of course, we have a solution for the uncoordinated EV charging system. And if I were to look at this, what does this allow? And I'm just going to play this video in the background. I hope you can see it, and I'll talk about it. This is a developed solution at UWI, where we have taken what would be the equivalent of a simple non-smart charger, which does not have any of the communication protocols, and we have simply managed to control it from a smartphone. And that now allows us the flexibility to have a utility, for instance, and a customer engage in some bilateral where the utility can say, well, here's what I'm going to allow you to charge your vehicle at 100% at this time. I'm going to allow you to charge it at 50% at this time, or you can simply override that and take 100% of the charge based on your immediate needs. But what it does give us, it gives us the flexibility of knowing that there's some measure of optimization that can take place. Now, the infrastructure required for that on a policy level is totally different, but it's not a technological obstacle. And that is pretty useful for small island developing states where a time of use tariff does not exist. So this is something we have done here, and it is a solution that can be rolled out and can be employed, right? So what about modeling? What is important for us to recognize is that each customer has its own profile of data, whether you are a household with one person, with 4 people, with 10 people, you'll have your own load profile. And then, of course, we have seen from some some research that we have done looking at existing profiles in the US, other parts of the world. EV charging patterns will be dictated by their driving styles. They will be dictated by the cost of electricity. But utilizing these two fundamental bits of data with the incentives and the measures that are employed locally, we can improve our load forecasting. And this will help us facilitate the migration from an uncoordinated charging to a coordinated charging scheme with a lot more accuracy. And these two graphs represent that. What you can see here essentially is on the left side where you have no EV charging, and on the right side where you have EV charging, what you would notice would be there is no time of use tariff. So you can see some higher heights and some lower lows. And if you look at the magnitudes of the scale on the y-axis, it indicates that the shape is fundamentally fairly same, but it provides us with the evidence that we need to do some more modeling. And when you break that down, we can be able to identify the periods during which people would charge. So that gives you an appreciation of, okay, well, their consumer habits. And this is across the 24 hours in a day, the 7 days of the week for this specific data set, which is based in the US, highlighting to us that the majority of charging actually takes place later on in the night. And if you look here from this graph, it's from around 5 p.m. onward when people are usually home. So we did our analysis on these models and we've come up with what would be the equivalent models. So now we will have an opportunity to work with Dr. King and his team and say, okay, these are the types of models from a driving perspective on the cycle. This is what the charging profile could look like, and therefore we can move that step forward. But of course, we have a challenge with data locally, and access to that data remains something that challenges us. Our analysis on the grid identified that conservative 5% on select feeders would be sufficient, 5% penetration would be sufficient to bring us at the transformers loading limits. So we need to do some more work to improve that and get a better appreciation of where the limits actually lie based on actual data that represents driving cycles, that represents the customer load profiles. And then, of course, this brings us to the next eventual evolution, which is utilizing the electric vehicle to supply power to the grid. And what you can see here is the V2G aspect that I mentioned before allows us to flatten the demand curve. The vehicle as a battery source will now provide energy to the grid. And think about this for a second. Those car parks in Port of Spain, imagine if they were converted into these massive battery stations where we could now have vehicles charging and discharging and providing some measure of comfort, given we have a resource there that's moving on wheels. These are all considerations from an electric grid perspective that we need to be mindful of. So I'm going to wrap up a bit. Before I do, well, solar car parking lots, similar to what I've just discussed. And then, of course, the renewable energy does play a role for us, but our challenges in the region, and not so much the technology and the adoption of the technology, but it's the limited electrical infrastructure to support the charging. The implementation of public charging stations, particularly in this country, and then, of course, little or no policy implementation at this time. I do know that the CARICOM has been working on a regional electric vehicle strategy. So that has gone to COTED, so that's in the pipeline. And my last two slides will be focusing on what the UWI has done. We have participated in the public advisory for electric vehicles because we know about the safety aspects, looking at the NFPA code and understanding that there's a safety element because you're now connecting to the electrical system. We have installed our EV charger here, and now the next step for us is to move this to being totally renewable. And of course, we have been very involved in assisting the TTBS with policy formulation, and the draft public standard has been out for comment. So I do believe that that should be wrapped up pretty shortly. And this is part 4 of the TTS 171 interconnection requirements for the electric vehicle chargers. Our studies at EWI have been engaging the commission to look at scenarios that can help identify what would be the limits of integration on the system. It's not an easy study because you need to have a lot of data and you need to have a lot of granular data, but it's something that we continue to do work on here. This is a list of some of the e-mobility publications, and in conclusion, this is a hot topic, no pun. So we're gonna have to embrace and adapt it. It's here to stay. There's a lot of opportunities, and we know there's gonna be a lot of challenges. From a bird's eye view, no pun again, we need to have a roadmap, which is a policy, a technical and a commercial aspect of that roadmap that will inform our targets. And most importantly, we need to actively ensure we are not a dumping ground for technologies that have no other access to markets. So I will end there. Thank you very much, Chair. Over to you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Nicola, we have time for one question.
Okay, great. Dr. Badur Singh. Okay, so we have one question for you now and a few later on. So the question is, could charging stations, unlike gas stations, be an investment only by the government at first, since not all persons interested in purchasing a battery electric vehicle may be able to afford the installation of a private charging station? This could also help with coordinating charging.
So thank you for the question. To be fair, that question is, it's not a new question. It has generated sufficient discussion. To give you an answer like that, this is a difficult one because the issue of selling energy can only occur with utility. So the method in which you go about that, it's something that requires a little more investigation on to ensure that from a transparent perspective, there are no violations. So I can't give you an answer to that at this point based on the complexities surrounding the energy uses and how that is qualified. But once you do not sell energy, you will not be violating the law. So people look at selling time and they also look at selling space. So those are ways that can move towards it, and it's going to be disruptive. But at this point in time, it's the classic chicken and egg. So I'm sorry if I can't give you the answer you're looking for, but I know what you're looking for. But perhaps we can discuss that in the session after.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Dr. Townsend.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you very much, Sanjay, for that very riveting presentation. We now go on to our final presenter for the day. This is Dr. Julia Kotzebue. She's currently an assistant professor at the Institute of Geography at the University of Hamburg, and she's a guest researcher on behalf of the German Research Foundation at our Department of Geography, UB St. Augustine. So that I'm going to move right on to Julia, who's going to do her presentation on digitization and mobility and a new paradigm. Dr. Kotzebue?
Yeah, can you hear me well? First question.
I'm hearing you loud and clear.
All right, then I will start sharing my screen.
Seeing your screen as well.
Okay, great. So yeah, we have heard a lot about sustainability towards e-mobility. And as Sanjay rose, a big problem in the e-mobility is the access of data. And a role in future development will play for sure the digitalization of mobility and transport. And therefore, I would like to bring the attention to that issue in this symposium. So I will be a little bit provocative and asking if we have to might rethink the paradigm of transport. So before I address the specific situation in Trinidad and Tobago, I like first to would like to bring the attention to what do I mean with rethinking the paradigm. So in the past, transport, maybe also especially in engineering, transport was a technical issue, often associated with specific technologies like the motor car, bus, train. And we also see in the approach to, for instance, e-mobility, that there is a big technical aspect in it. But this also has a perspective on the individual transport and a shift. What we see in big cities all over the world is a sort of transformation, or we could also call it transition towards mobility, which brings the attention more to the ability for people to move and the experience of the people for moving, as well as the social cultural impacts of movements and transport. We saw in our first, in the first presentation of Dr. Cohen, that the social aspect was very important in the rating of sustainability. And so we probably have to rethink the paradigm from coming from transport towards more mobility perspective. We know that transport creates, have these, unfortunately, these side effects. In the past, we tried to create our cities and our living environment around the transportation mode. We widened our roads to make it accessible for fast cars. We see that there's a change also the picture of cities. For instance, when we look to Trinidad and Tobago in the 60s, there were quite a lot of bicycles around in Port of Spain. I saw a picture of these. At the moment, I use my bicycle here in Trinidad and Tobago. I feel not really safe to bicycle on the road. So we try to create the world around the technology, and that also has a side effect that at the moment road transport produces the most greenhouse gas emissions, and worldwide transportation accounts for more than 20% to the CO2 emission, to the global CO2 emissions. So we have to do something. And digital, the information and communication technology for sure has a very important role in this. But we also have to question ourselves if the digitalization at the moment brings opportunities for all. But let us first look at the benefits. So the information and communication technologies helps to optimize the transport. The demand and the supply, we create real data. Transport distances can be optimized with regards to the infrastructure, the vehicle capacity, traveling time, cost, network capacities, and also very important, the choice of transport. So we see that digitalization apps help, for instance, to streamline traffic flows. Digital and real-time information helps to regulate the traffic flow, the speed of the cars. We see smart traffic management system, which regulates the stoplights. We can regulate also that stoplights for bicycles are always on green, for instance. And also apps play a very important role in what I said in the choice of the transport mode. And it also creates not only for the general traffic management, but also individually, it creates a lot of opportunities. For instance, for people who have special needs in transport, disadvantaged people could use the app to figure out what would be the most convenient and fast way to travel, and to get, it helps to get reliable information for safe transport to jobs, essential needs, schooling, and recreation. These are all the benefits. A very big benefit is we all struggle with, all presenters rose this problem, the lack of data. To have and to steer future developments, we need data, and we need reliable data, unbiased data if possible. And digitalization can play a very important role in this perspective, because it provides real-time data to the companies. And that is one problem, that at the moment it is not clearly regulated who owns the data. So at the moment, the service providers can generate a lot of data. However, it does not mean that governments or the academic has access to that data. So this creates an imbalance in the data ownership with regards to the digital development. So we have to clarify who in future owns data, and also with regards to who produce the data. Not all the people who are using apps are conscious that they produce data. So there's a lot of ethical issues, but it just started. The field of ethic and digitalization ethics just started recently. And there are, what I just started to mention is that there are these problems on who owns the data. So it indicates that there are some drawbacks with regards to the digitalization. At the moment, the ICT development is highly uneven. So not everybody benefits in the same amount. And the development shows a content, spatial, ethical, income gap between the included and excluded people and features. So Sharon and Kuhan did a lot of research, not only in America, but also in South America and in Europe. And the research indicated that at the moment, sharing services and apps are mainly offered in well-situated urban centers and urban areas, mostly around transport hubs like international railway stations, airports and ports, as well as in well-developed and situated neighborhoods. This is with regards to who invests in these in this market. And as Dr. King rose, the costs of e-mobility, for instance. So the customers would like to use e-mobility, cannot afford their own car, so they sharing mobility is a good opportunity, but the companies who invest in this are at the moment car companies and companies who are already on the market, like for instance car rental companies. And with the bike sharing, we have a similar picture. Then there's also a big gap or imbalance between the content and the features. For instance, according to the Airport Council International, the most airlines use booking and e-ticketing devices and technologies. But compared to, for instance, walkability apps or bicycling apps, they just recently entered the market. And these affects also the development of other mobility apps. For instance, these who gives information about the choice of transport mode. So which do I use? Do I use the plane, the boat, or a bus maybe? Because as soon as the alternative mode is not digitalized, so it's not in the system, the app cannot use the data. So this is visible when you try to figure out when you want to travel overseas and want to try to use a ferry system. It's quite hard to use it because all the airlines are in, and ferry systems are not that much digitalized as the airlines. Okay, then what I wrote, there is also a problem with regards to the spatial distribution of access and also of the infrastructure. So even when apps and services are well functioning and well used in the urban area, many of those show that they not serve, for instance, in rural area. Another issue is poor and unplanned areas. They also have a lot of problems with the infrastructure. So when they have not a good internet access, they cannot even use the offered services because of the poor infrastructure, for instance. So this is all linked. Linked is also other discriminative aspects, like, for instance, the pay functions. That even when you are located in an urban area, that many apps use the digital banking system and linked to it. So when you are not, you don't have a credit card, you are, for instance, a micro entrepreneur who was on regular income, or you just entered the job market, so you have no financial credibility according to the leading banking system, then you are out of the service. You cannot access that properly. So this results in a very unbalanced market, and also in an unbalanced use and unbalanced benefits from that market. A challenge is in that digitalization, in the digitalization development, is the complexity of mobility. So we see that apps, for instance, Addressing and Gosling made an inventarization and published in 2018, and this was not up to date, so I had to include some of these. We see that the apps have a very diverse diverse service. So we see that there's a sharing mobility, which starts with bicycling sharing, ride sharing, park sharing, car sharing, taxi service, and scooter sharing just recently started in Europe and in America. We have travel information, planning and routing. I addressed that they give information which route you should use. We have payment and price comparisons, and also here, when we speak about data, we see a biased image. Those who are in the system, who have digitalized their prices, they are in the system, so they will be compared. Those who are not, like, for instance, maxi taxis, they will be not necessarily in the system. Then we have a safety. This is also an issue, partly because some of these apps, or not some, the most of the apps are crowd feeded, so they get the information from the crowd when you use it, or when you provide information. And for instance, issues like safety perception can be very biased. Imagine it is an app on which tells you if it's safe to bicycle a certain route or to place your car in a certain area, and people can add safety problems to that map. Remember that I addressed that issue that, for instance, unplanned areas or poor areas or rural areas have far less access to internet services. They probably do not know that such an app exists, or they have no access. So very often the information comes from people outside certain areas, and they can create very easily a certain image about the area, which is not necessarily the real image. So then there are apps about health, which tells you how much kilometer you have to walk, convenience and space and distribution, like Google Maps, for instance. So let's take a look to the digitalization in Trinidad and Tobago, to the specific situation. There, I struggled with other colleagues with the data availability, so I made an inventarization on my own. And please correct me if you see some or have a different perspective. I realized that in general, government is very open to the digitalization of the transport and mobility market. The infrastructure team got a special attention in the Vision 2030, and it is stated that in this regard, the focus will be also on combining smart technology investment and innovation. So generally, it is very open. However, if we see how the market attracts service providers, then we see that in 2015, the first provider entered the market, which was a taxi app. Since then, a lot of the service providers joined. Some provide data, some not. So it is not really clear who entered the market, who is off of the market. And then this brings us also to a problem. So at the moment, the market faces an outdated legislation, an outdated framework. In the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Act, it is stated that every vehicle is used as a taxi must be registered as a driver, and taxi drivers need a license. So when it comes to sharing mobility in cars, for instance, this can create problems. And we see that also in the investment of the market. At the moment, the most investment is taxi companies who acted already on the market. And this creates a sort of imbalanced access to the market. So there is a need to create new regulations with regards to the sharing mobility, but also with regards to e-mobility infrastructural aspects. Another problem is that there's little transparency in the market. What I said, the service provider themselves provide partly data, partly not. And furthermore, what I discovered is that some service providers provide no contact address, no tax number, no company detail, no detail about investors and shareholders. This is very important when you download an app and you decide probably to share your rights because you want to behave environmental friendly. You would like to know who invests in these companies, because a lot of these apps operate with shareholders, are not owned by one person. And these shareholders and these investors could also come from environmental dirty companies. So it is also very little detail about the paying services. So I discovered that some apps only work or invest also in cryptocurrency. So there is little transparency and control. Where is the money going to? Who benefits from the money I invest in this company? With regards to to security and also in transparency, this is reflected also in the customer review. I made a content analysis of the reviews that customers sent to the service providers, and that showed that many customers complain that they have to provide bio data, partly biometric data, with a full picture and all access to their own contacts, access to their location, without getting any information what and how the data is used. Because this is also the market of data is also a big business. Clients also complained that they cannot delete partly their account. So that means once you gave probably access to a company to all your details, they can use that, and your mobile division sends constantly data how you're moving to this company, although you're probably not even using the service anymore. Then also on the Trinidad market, clients complained about the costs and that service providers only allowed virtual payment and that exclude users from these services. So compared to, for instance, private hired vehicles, these app hired vehicles are more expensive. For the future perspective and the rural development, I want to give you some insights from a project I'm involved at the moment, a pilot study in Charlottesville and Tobago. We did a survey there, which ran 10 months, and we had a representative survey. And that survey showed that 65% of the villages use a maxi taxi as main mode of transport. 32% use their own car, and that's remarkable now that 24% say that someone gave them a lift. This survey did not show whether it's as a private hired vehicle or if it is the person out of the village and people know each other, and one of these 32% who owns a car and use their own car and share that with people who know who needs a lift. But what this clearly indicates is that only 12% of the rural people in that case of the village use a taxi. So the offered services and digitalization, which is mainly offered by taxi companies at the moment on the market, does not give opportunities for the rural population because they are mainly using the maxi taxi system. So also the digitalization of the public transport would not necessarily in that amount benefit the people to the current situation. Probably it could improve the situation of the public transport. So with having that in mind, we have to question ourselves how in which direction we want to steer the digitalization. In any case, what we see is a development that the use of applications and platforms is increasing in Trinidad and Tobago, and combined with the knowledge and the information we got, for instance, from Dr. King and Dr. Sanji, we have to think about probably a new paradigm of transportation. Yeah, all copyrights are covered by Pixabay, and here's some information. So that was my perspective.
Okay,
Thank you very
thank
much.
you very much.
Yes, over to you, Nicola.
Sorry, Dr. Townsend. Thank you, Dr. Townsend. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kutzbu. So we will now go into our Q&A session. We have a few questions for each presenter, and we'll start with Dr. King. So, Dr. King, do we have the service technicians in Trinidad and Tobago to deal with electric vehicles? What kind of training might be required?
Hi, yeah, that's an excellent question. Right now, I think there are only about 2 or 3 service garages that I know about which have electric vehicle and technology expertise. But that's growing quite quickly because of the number of hybrid vehicles That's not plug-in hybrid, but just regular hybrid vehicles that have been coming into Trinidad in the last few years with the incentive structure. So they also have high voltage systems. The main challenge with electric vehicle servicing and so on, most of the servicing is very straightforward. But when it comes to the power side of things, batteries and motors and so on, you know, that's where the risk comes, because it's high voltage and high current in many cases stuff. So specialist training is required, but it's coming. And I think CCRE, for instance, the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, they are providing train-the-trainer sessions, which are available for subscription by people across the Caribbean, so we can start to build that base of expertise. So it's not really there right now, but I think it's not going to be a big issue in the medium term.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. King. Next question is for Dr. Kutzbu. So the question is, how can we promote spatial balance in the digital transport process?
Yeah, this is a very tough question. I think what we see now in the most cities around the world in the whole transition process is that this process is mainly market steered. And I think that from my perspective, the market cannot fully regulate this development. We can see that also in the investments of the market in Trinidad, especially small markets like, and then partly isolated markets like in Trinidad. We cannot sort of hope that there are companies who would like to invest in that market. So I think there must come a sort of governmental initiative, a national initiative, also maybe from young developers who develop applications specifically for these markets, to create they operate in a certain sense on a niche market because it's small, but I think we cannot wait for the economy to invest in that smaller market. This is very
okay. Sorry, thank you very much, Dr. Kutzbu. Okay, so we'll go on to Engineer Dulcie. The question for you is, why has the government not converted its fleet to CNG?
That's a very interesting question. I would not be able to answer the question because I don't represent the government, but I do think it is a good idea for the government to start with its own fleet. In that way, they would be setting the trend and basically doing what they're asking the persons of Trinidad and Tobago to do, and they would be able to report on the progress in terms of, you know, the numbers in terms of conversions, and perhaps track the emissions and so on in a better way.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Dr. Badur Singh. Question for you is, can the electricity grid cope with electric vehicles?
So the answer to that really depends on where these electric vehicles are going to be installed. Well, I should say where the chargers are going to be installed. And if we take it as simply the ability to charge the vehicles, then it will hinge evidently on the nature of the local geographical region where they're going to be supported. In a nutshell, yes, they can, but there's going to be a limit that is peculiar to each particular pocket of the grid. And that is something that only as the penetration increases, you'll get an appreciation for where that limit is. Studies can help to inform us of that, as I mentioned. So the answer is yes, it can, but up to a particular limit.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Next question is for Dr. King. And the question, and also a suggestion, is what would be the impact of all government vehicles in public transportation vehicles being battery electric vehicles? I'm suggesting that the government could lead in this way towards the sustainable goal. It may be useful to show our leaders that they could lead by example in this way.
Yes. I mean, I think it would be a very significant aspiration. I mean, that's not something you could do overnight. It would have to be a program that rolled out over a period of time. In as much as I think the majority of government vehicles would probably need to go through a replacement cycle and be replaced with a battery electric equivalent. I think only really in the last couple of years would you find, and it will be even more so in the next couple of years, that you find that the range of different types of vehicle that the government would purchase are available as battery electric vehicles. So only now really are we starting to get the product lineup that could make that feasible at all. But particularly for buses, the buses, I don't think we're really buying any diesel buses again, and we shouldn't be. I think the buses that are being purchased are either natural gas, but maybe some battery electric vehicles will come in that mix in the future. We have been looking at the possibility of doing some conversions of older diesel buses to a kind of hybrid natural gas and battery electric. That would have the advantage of providing extended range, so you don't have to keep bringing the vehicle back to recharge it during the course of normal daily operations. So there's a number of things that the government certainly could do, and it points to the policy. An example, I think, is a very relevant point, that if the government is to show some kind of leadership, that will accelerate the transformation for sure, and will help us achieve our targets.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kin. Sadly, we only have time for one more question, and that question is going to go to Dr. Kutzbu. So the question is, how can we create social justice and sustainability in the digitalization transport?
Yeah, I think this question is really much related to the mode of transport we are using, and this needs a shift of thinking. What Dr. King was saying, when we speak about electrification, we cannot only have in mind the private vehicles and the personal transport. I think we have to reframe it a little bit and come more to the perspective where all benefits all from it. So we see that studies in Denmark, for instance, showed that the most of urban space is dedicated in transport. The most of urban space is reserved for the car, and very little is reserved for bicycles and walkers, although the majority of the people walk and bicycle. Another study showed in Canada, for instance, that the investment in public transport brings much more jobs than an investment in road and infrastructure, in the road infrastructure. So I think social justice is also linked to the aspect that we might have to give up a little bit the idea we were trained for, that the individual car use is the most and the best mode of transport, and that we can have fast transport also by using other modes of transport. This is also related when we sit in a car and in a congestion and come too late to work, and we say, yeah, we were in our car, everybody say, oh, okay, yes, I experienced too. So it's accepted in society. When we bicycle, we could probably be healthy, come on time, and this, I hope this will be socially accepted as well as a mode of transport, for instance.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kutzbu. And that ends our Q&A session. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but we did receive a lot of good ones. For the questions that were not answered, we have made note of them, and we will try to distribute some answers for you. If you do have any other questions, there's an email address that has been posted in the chat, transportation.symposium sta.ue.edu. So you can send your additional questions there and we'll try our best to give you answers. Thank you everyone for listening to the Q&A session, and I'll turn back over to Dr. Townsend.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And indeed, what we will do, there are so many other questions, and the panelists have agreed that they will stay on for a few minutes afterwards, after we do our official close, so that for those who have an interest in continuing the discussion a little later, we will have our official close of our webinar, and then the panelists have agreed that they will forego their lunch. I'm not going to buy lunch for them later, but they will stay on just to continue the discourse a little longer for those who may wish to do so. Let me now invite the President-elect of the Association of Professional Engineers of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Chris Maraj, to give his concluding remarks on behalf of APET, and then we will continue that extended discourse. So here's Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Townsend. On behalf of APET, I would like to thank the UE for organizing and the presenters for sharing their knowledge with the audience, and for the audience and the associated participation and interest. Seminars such as these are instrumental for moving the country and the region forward. Thanks again. Over to you, Dr. Townsend.
Thank you very much, Chris. And it was our pleasure to work in partnership with APET. Again, thanks to the presenters, and also thanks to the marketing and communications team who provide that platform and that the whole management of our process. So, Nicola, if you're still around, I think you still are. Back to you again, because I know you had another battery of questions for our presenters.
Okay, sure. I'll be happy to. All right, so moving forward with the questions, the next one will go to Engineer Dulcie. And the question is, will increasing the number of CNG and electric vehicles result in a more sustainable transportation system?
Okay, that's a good question. The answer is yes and no, in that increasing the number of alternative fuel vehicles, yes, will contribute to some sustainability effects, but it will also increase the number of vehicles on the road. So for it to have the effect that we're looking for, it also needs to be coupled with some sort of deregistration or decommissioning of the internal combustion engine vehicles as well. So it's not something that will solve the problem on its own. As shown in the framework, you need to incorporate the other aspects of sustainability, and you also need to find a balance. Yes, you bring in some new vehicles that will help to solve the issue, but you also get rid of those that are causing the issue.
Okay, thanks for that enlightenment. All right, we'll go over to Dr. Bahadur Singh for the next question, which is an electric vehicle safe to plug in?
Yes, it's very safe to plug in. There are many standards that are utilized in the actual design of the vehicle's charging systems. So from a user perspective, you have no harm in plugging in the charger into the vehicle. The safety really comes from the interconnection with the device, the charger, and your house. So usually there are standards that give us a little more insight into the restrictions, particularly for circuits. And once we do not violate those codes, we will ensure that there are no fires and there are no other hazards electrically that can provide us with some measure of risk. And it is safe as long as it's utilized how it's supposed to be utilized.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, Dr. King, I'm sure you would have considered the culture of Trinidadians when it comes to gaining buy-in for such a vehicle. What were the findings from your research?
Yeah, so we did look at this a bit in our survey studies, asking people about their interest in purchasing or their expectation of purchasing a sort of battery electric vehicle in the future, or plug-in vehicle. Basically, I think the limitation as it stands is the number of models that are available on the market. So up till now, really, the only electric vehicle we could buy in Trinidad from a dealer would be the Hyundai Ioniq, which is a fairly small car. It's not an SUV, but I think that will change in the future. We'll have to see whether the change in the duty structure causes the electric vehicles to become too expensive. It might do, I think, to be attractive or competitive with sort of gasoline, diesel equivalents. But I think that what will affect that culture or people's willingness to consider an electric vehicle is the sort of aspirational nature. Like electric vehicles have much better driving characteristics than an equivalent ICE engine vehicle. They're quicker, they're quiet, and a lot of technology is being put into the products that are coming on the market. So they, right now, if you compare two similar vehicles, one is battery electric, one is regular ICE, the battery electric vehicle has a lot of advantages just as a vehicle or as a product. And I think that's what will cause people to be attracted to them as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. King. If you would stay on, the next one is also for you. Despite presenting on internal combustion engine vehicles as a whole, have you done any analysis on CNG versus other types of ICEs, particularly for fleet vehicles like trucking or public transportation?
Not done in-depth analysis. We do intend to set up our models and run that analysis as well, but we still haven't got around to doing it yet. But I mean, just to speak from basic knowledge, converting, say, a diesel heavy-duty vehicle to natural gas has a lot of advantages. For instance, when you burn natural gas, the carbon content is lower than diesel, so you get an instant CO2 gain of around 30%, 20, maybe 20%, because even though you get less carbon in your natural gas, the engine will become less efficient because you now have a spark ignition engine as opposed to a compression ignition engine. One of the problems with conversions, as opposed to sort of OEM vehicles or new vehicles coming that have natural gas already installed as a powertrain, if you want to convert a diesel vehicle, then you do have that problem. You have to either replace the engine, or you might have to do some kind of hybrid system which loses some of the efficiency. So it has drawbacks, but it does have big benefits: much cleaner, lower levels of maintenance, lower carbon emissions, and of course, in a Trinidad context, because gas is so cheap, it'll be even more economical to run than the diesel equivalent. So that's something we can really promote hard.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Dr. Kotzbu, how can we agree and guarantee data ethical standards in the digitalization of transport?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question because, as I mentioned, the academic field of data ethics just started. So there is at the moment no guarantee with regards to data use, data markets, who is allowed to provide data, get data. So you see also in other fields that governments struggle with big providers like Google, especially on the American market. You see that. On the one hand, governments also depend on these investors in the digital market, on the big investors, as they bring a lot of infrastructure, like, for instance, server capacities and that. On the other hand, dependencies also increase. So I think it needs a commission of service providers, government, and also the juridical field to think about really national standards and international standards. At the moment, It is more a national approach, and it is a difficult road. It just started.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Katsulu. All right, Dr. Badur Singh, do we need charging infrastructure?
Do we need charging infrastructure? Is that a
Yes.
question, Nicola? Yeah.
Yes, that's the question.
So yes and no, it depends on how you intend to utilize your electric vehicle. But to ensure widespread adoption and ensure that you can reduce the range anxiety, charging infrastructure would definitely accommodate that. So that is the yes to it, because you will facilitate movement that is greater than the range of your vehicle, or by some factor. In the islands, given that we have relatively low ranges to work with, it's not as critical, but it provides some level of comfort, and it can also provide a level of inducement for customer commercial aspects. So for instance, if it is you're going out to the supermarkets and you're going out to the commercial centers, it all provides an opportunity. You can charge there while doing your business. So there's a host of complementary services that having a charging infrastructure will facilitate on a commercial side. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Engineer Dosey. The figure shown for number of vehicles in use provided by the Ministry of Transport appears to be the number of vehicles registered from P/H1 through to PZ/HDZ 999, which is just over 1 million. Has anyone attempted to estimate the number of registered vehicles no longer on the roads?
I had that question as well, and during my visit to the Ministry of Works, where I got the information, they had no records of how many vehicles had been deregistered or how many were no longer in use. So whereas the data for the registered vehicles showed we had 800 and something, there was no definite value as to how many are on the roads. So
If I could just chip in there, I mean, I have to comment. I think that's an absolute travesty. I find the government and the licensing office should hang its head in absolute shame that they don't know what vehicles actually registered on the road at this point in time. And I think that's something that the government should take as being an important and very urgent priority, because you don't know what happens to those vehicles that are no longer in use. You don't have a proper scrappage scheme. You don't have any way of deregistering a vehicle. Those things are really, really a shame and a disgrace and need to be urgently addressed, not only from a data point of view, but also from a governance point of view.
Yeah, but Graham, the law requires that vehicles be deregistered.
Yes, the Motor Vehicles Act requires that.
The problem is that there's no one who has an interest in enforcing it. And especially since they moved away from annual vehicle licensing fees, then even the interest got even lessened. So the law is there. Even under the current legislation, you are supposed to deregister your vehicle if it is not in use. And but it's just that there's no one with an interest in enforcing it.
But in that case, then that means that the licensing office should be able to give you an immediate answer.
No,
it might not be an accurate answer because there might be vehicles that have not been technically deregistered, but they must be able to give you an answer of the number of currently licensed vehicles, and that's a number we can work with.
No, the number of currently registered vehicles, not the number of currently licensed vehicles, because we don't do vehicle licensing again. We just do registration once.
Right.
And if someone does apply to deregister, they will deregister them. So their number would have included the few people who actually deregistered their vehicles. But the questioner's point is very valid. In a way, we need to perhaps have a different way of approaching the COM, since the licensing has no interest in that information. And there will be other ways in which you could try to simulate that data or estimate that data, utilizing household travel surveys as well as surveys of businesses that own vehicles.
Can I also
Okay.
link on this discussion very briefly?
Right, Julia?
Nicole? I would play the ball also back from government to the vehicle owner. Just to give an example, our neighbor, a household with 2 people, have 4 cars registered in their garden. I think, and they all use them once a while. I think there is no incentive at the moment for car owners to to leave old cars or to deregister old cars, and there is no incentive to buy also new cars. I think there must be a kind of tax for owning a car. Just to give a comparison, in Germany, one of the highest costs of a car is the car tax just to let the car register and to own, which you have to pay annually. And this is one of the highest costs of all the costs. So young people think about of buying a car, and households have only 1 car they share because of these. Just simply to have a car costs already money. And here households can collect cars, sort of.
Okay, thank you for that discussion, guys. I think that means the discussion needs to be taken a little bit further. And hopefully we have persons here in the panelists and attendees who will do what needs to be done, right? So we'll move on with the next question. All right, and that is for Dr. King. And the question is, arguments noted on carbon benefits of transitioning to battery electrical vehicles in tandem with direction of the developed economies of the world. Can you also comment on the options available for the pool of existing vehicles from a carbon savings point of view? Also, what are the trends expected for the market share if internal combustion engines to be phased in pragmatic terms?
Okay, let me unmute. Yeah, I think that's something which that little bit of analysis I did at the end of my presentation showed up, that even if we have a fairly aggressive growth of alternative fuel vehicles or electrified vehicles in the market, that in itself isn't going to necessarily have the big impact we'd want on carbon reduction unless we do something with like the existing fleet. And that links directly to the previous conversation, I think. That we really have to, and this comes down to government policy or government strategy again. We have to look at a way to try to reduce the number of gasoline and diesel vehicles in particular, which are on the roads and in use. That might be through some kind of conversion. I think that's where CNG conversion comes in, because the conversion to CNG does have a CO2 benefit. I think that there's a scrappage scheme is absolutely necessary in there as well. I think that quotas are going to be very important, so that we don't allow just a kind of a proliferation of vehicles on the road that overstretch our infrastructure. So there's quite a number of issues there. I think in terms of the future and the sort of the banning of IC engines, I'm not too sure how that's going to pan out. It could be that because the sale of these IC engines is being banned in many developed markets, they'll become cheaper. And almost like old tech, which I think that's the point Sanjay was making in his presentation, that we need to avoid becoming a dumping ground of outdated technology. So that's a consideration, which we want to avoid. But also it could mean that the manufacturers transition their production capabilities away from IC engines. And if that happens, they won't come on the market anymore. And they'll not be available. So then in a sense, our hand will be forced and we'll have to go to the newer technologies as new vehicle sales. But all the time, I mean, there are 2 factors here. One is the number or the proportion of new vehicles entering our fleet, which are energy efficient or electrified, and then the other side of the equation is what's the total growth of our fleet? Because if our fleet just continues to grow like it has in the last few years, then we're not really going to get CO2 savings.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. King. All right, I have a question here, not necessarily directed to any presenter. So I'm going to throw it out and see who wants to take it. And the question is, do you agree, and it can be a discussion as well, do you agree with the foreign car dealers that the new budget will cripple the move towards AFBs? Who would like to take this one?
All right.
I guess it can, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to volunteer you, Graham. Let me just start off by saying that I do understand the context within which this is moving towards, and to some extent, it will have an impact. Whether it is crippling or not, I'm not in a position to say that, but it certainly does not incentivize from that perspective. So I'll stop there and allow Graham to comment, and then I can always come back in.
Yeah, I mean, basically I agree with Sanjay. I think that it's going to slow down the transition a lot. It's going to be very difficult to demonstrate to manufacturers that our market is one that's worth servicing with the new vehicles that are coming out, the new electrified vehicles. And that's one of the challenges, is supply or availability of vehicles. So that's going to be difficult. But I do think the other thing is that cost of ownership equation. If people are willing to make an upfront investment and able to make an upfront investment, the calculations I did there sort of show that the cost of ownership is still going to be lower. Now that's assuming that the price of electricity remains as it is. So I haven't done any future casting or scenario planning really about what happens if electricity follows a certain trajectory of cost, what happens if vehicle fuels, like liquid fuels, follow a certain trajectory of cost. So it could end up that if your electricity price now goes up as well, then the battery of electric vehicles are no longer cost effective from an ownership point of view. And if you buy one, then you're doing it either because it's an aspirational product or because you're very committed to sort of energy efficiency. And then that's going to end up being a very, very small market share. So these are some of the things that are going to affect the way the market develops.
Just to come back in on that, to add to Graham's point too, given that things are so fluid at this time, there's a chance that that could change as well, because a lot of the initiatives that are put forward out there do not necessarily mean that they are going to follow through on certain bits if there's sufficient lobbying and there's sufficient stakeholders coming together to put the business case forward. Because from an economical perspective, and so from an economy perspective, the idea behind ensuring that the sector can sustain and the loss of jobs, all those things come into play. So there are other sides that have to be considered, particularly given the times we're in. So I'm fairly certain that that is not the final move as yet, and there may be a lot more that we can expect in terms of shifts from that particular position.
Yeah, and I think it also, what you put your finger on there, Sanjay, the issue of predictability and stability is very important in government policy. So what's happened is that basically there is an incentive in place that was encouraging sort of say use car dealers to follow a trajectory in which products they source, and then all of a sudden that incentive's removed. So now we're in a situation where there's no stability, there's a lot of uncertainty about where things are going to go, and that's not going to help to create a stable development track.
And one more consideration to add to that, Graham, is when you look at from the announcement that was made to lead time for the concession, which is at the end of the year, I am sure there would have been a push in the sales of vehicles, which actually goes counterproductive to what the initial statement was, which is to reduce the number of vehicles on the road. So there's some measure of disconnect in terms of the direction, and perhaps that's why I say that I'm pretty certain that there may be more to come in terms of that particular direction. So I'll stop there. I see Julia wants to make a comment.
Yeah, I would like to make again the comment that when you see electricity vehicle use in other countries like Europe or America, a lot of investment comes from the car industry itself, who invested in the shared market. So I think it is not enough to address as business as usual to address the car owner, but it is very important to see it more in the complex way that we have to change the mobility behavior, which I mean changing in the sense, according to my research, 60% of the people are already sharing, but they have a little voice in the policy. And so I think if you really would like to have a boost on the market, you have to create a market not only on the individual level, but also on the community level. That means making attractive for maxi taxis, for instance, to become electrified, creating incentives for bicycle, especially motorbikes, for instance, to buy these also for the sharing market, not only for the individuals, but also for the sharing market, and also the public transport and electrification of the public transport must be addressed in that matter.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Nicola.
Go ahead, Dr.
I was just going to ask Graham 2 questions about that same costing issue. Did you do a scenario or modeling with the costing that was either at the production cost level or the unsubsidized price levels? And the other question is, what sort of discount rate did you use for your future in the assumptions in terms of the future values?
The cost model is a very simple, non-discounted model. So we could definitely improve, refine the model from that point of view. So everything is at today's prices. But in terms of the first part of your question, which was the
were you using subsidized prices or unsubsidized costs?
Yeah, I did both. So I think there are 2 tables I put forward. The first one was for the smaller vehicles, which was using the subsidized prices. That was using the available vehicle, the Hyundai Ioniq. Then I did another table which used an assumption of an imported vehicle that I have data for, and compared it with, and I assumed that for that one you would be paying duties and taxes and so on.
Sorry, I didn't mean the subsidized vehicle purchase. I mean the fuel prices and electricity prices. Both the electricity prices and the liquid fuel prices are subsidized. At least they were but the trend is that they are going to be unsubsidized. And if you're actually going to be looking at things from an energy efficiency perspective,
yes,
I think we need to look at them in terms of the unsubsidized prices to see what the real cost would be.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the challenges now from that point of view is the fact that our oil prices are so low. So actually our liquid fuel prices are very low. So it's not, from that point of view, a conducive environment to promote e-mobility. But having said that, I think that I think what should be done, and so I'll answer your question, no, I haven't really built in scenarios that look at different potential trajectories of cost of electricity and cost of fuel. But I think what should be looked at is carbon-based taxation. And there's some schools of thought that say, in fact, in this day and age, rather than even personal income tax or corporation tax, that all taxation should probably be based on energy or carbon usage. And some system like that, which they do have in some jurisdictions, like in the UK, they use carbon-based taxing for sort of, if you have a company car, the tax you pay on your company car will depend on the carbon it uses. So a system like that could definitely sort of give both the government revenues that are required and also create a lot more sensitivity to really, the impact of energy use, which I think is one of the problems we have here. So long story short, no, I didn't look at those models in terms of projected pricing, but the carbon taxing is something we should definitely look at as an alternative way of raising government revenues. And that you could put on diesel, you could put on petrol, and on electricity as well.
Okay, thanks much, Dr. King. All right, we'll move on to another question. We have time for 2 more questions. This is one of them. And the question is for Dr. Kotzbu, sorry. And I think it was a follow-up to a response you had given to an earlier question. The question is, are you recommending away with the requirements for special licensing of drivers and vehicles that service public?
This question is related to private hired vehicles, right?
I think so.
And the question, just to make sure that I understood well, the question, if I recommend that there are some security measures and special licenses for these drivers, right?
Well, not so much for those drivers. I think it's for the public. So I'll repeat the question and we'll see. Are you recommending we do away with the requirements for special licensing of drivers and vehicles that serve the public?
Can you reframe the question?
I'm not sure.
Julia, my question.
Yes.
Basically, you mentioned that there's a challenge now in terms of the licensing and the laws being outdated. But that means the laws are outdated and the laws require, if you are driving a taxi, which is a public service vehicle, then your vehicle has to have certain requirements and you have to have certain requirements that are not necessary to hold for those who have their private vehicles. And my question to you was, in the context of the ride sharing, are you recommending that we do away with those special licensing arrangements for taxis and for taxi drivers? Sorry, I put it that way, but that's what I was trying to ask.
What I see on from the research on markets where taxi drivers operate and sharing mobility entered the market, what was shown is that they serve different clients. So it resulted in an effect that taxi drivers increased the quality standard, responding more on the needs of the clients, while the shared serve a total different market niche. So they can both operate on the market. What I think here for Trinidad and Tobago with regards licensing and insurance and all that problems, I think what an issue what we rose before was that there is a problem here in Trinidad and Tobago with regards to enforcing existing technical standards and licensing. So the government has very little grip on who is driving which vehicle, how long, and to which purpose. And a measurement or to improve the situation would be that you need a central register of living, so where you located and how many people live in this whole household and how many cars you have. I mean, if you do not have that digitalized, so that you can always, that even police officers who have to enforce, for instance, the law can check in their mobile if this car is registered or not, it becomes quite difficult to enforce standards. So it makes I think it makes no sense to introduce more standards. It makes more sense to see, first of all, how can we increase that existing standards will be enforced, and then building up on that. Is that a sufficient response?
It'll do for now. Go ahead, Nicola.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Townsend. And the last question goes to Engineer Dulcie and Dr. King. We can have Engineer Dulcie's response first and then go over to Dr. King. In terms of intermeasures, what about use of biodiesel as a replacement for fuel for older diesel fleets, such as container trucks?
Okay, my research didn't dig too deep into biofuel use, but I did come across some literature suggesting that it could be used, particularly for the internal combustion engines. But I was looking at something more large scale, and I guess if somebody is willing to invest into the infrastructure that would allow persons to use it, then it would not be a replacement, but it would be a substitute for some. And I mean, if you look at what's going on internationally, the trends are moving towards electric vehicles as opposed to going back to biodiesel. So it wouldn't be a replacement entirely, but it could substitute. I'm not sure what Dr. King's views are on this one.
Yeah, biodiesel definitely has
Any
potential.
comments?
Yeah, I said biodiesel definitely has potential. So one of the things we haven't really talked about, because we've been looking at e-mobility, but really the future going forward in the next 10, 15 years is not all just electric. What we expect to see is an increasing diversity of different sort of solutions to reducing carbon in transportation. Biodiesel is definitely part of it. And the issue, of course, is the feedstock. You have to have a sustainable source of feedstock to produce your biodiesel. That might mean sort of an agricultural solution where you put over some land to growing a suitable feedstock, like a Jeff flitter, I think, is one plant which could be used. It's an invasive species, so it has issues with it as well. So you have to take into account land use, you have to take into account all those kind of issues as well as infrastructure. You can get biodiesel from waste oil, especially like vegetable oil that's used for cooking and that kind of thing, but relatively small quantities. And there is a company in Trinidad that has been collecting the waste oil and processing it into biodiesel for use in their own vehicles. So there's sort of small scale operations with biodiesel. Another sort of consideration apart from biodiesel, we haven't talked at all today about hydrogen, which is another big deal of what's coming down the track. So a lot of these things like biodiesel might end up being surpassed by hydrogen, and Trinidad is very well set up as a potential hydrogen economy. So that's another topic for another day, but I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. King. And that response takes us to the end of our Q&A session. Thank you everyone for participating, and I'll turn over to Dr. Townsend.
Well, thank you very much, Nicola. And folks, as I thought, this thing can go on because there's so much to be discussed. And I think that we got a very good panorama on the perspectives. In particular, we heard from Engineer Kohan, those with respect to the measurement of sustainability. So because all these things that we say we want to do, if we can't measure what we're doing in terms of the impact on sustainability, then we would just be kind of guessing that this is a good thing or not a good thing. So that her framework was, I think, an important thing for us to consider. We heard from Dr. King about his interesting research with respect to the comparisons on how e-mobility is an efficient way of moving our vehicles. We heard some more from Dr. Bahadur Singh with respect to the relationship between the EVs and the grid, And some of the issues involved in that is not a straightforward issue at all on Sanjay's answer. That as well as some of the interesting things you heard from both Dr. King and Sanjay about some of the interesting things happening right here at the university in terms of research in that area. And then we heard the provocative research that Julia, Dr. Kotzebue has been doing in terms of the paradigm, or whole paradigm in terms of mobility, and touching on those TNCs and the whole digitization and what it means. Folks, this is the beginning of the discussion, not the end. In fact, what we are hoping is that in our transportation symposium that we're planning for next year, we are going to be able to have a number of breakout sessions, and in particular, a whole section of workshop on the whole issue of sustainability, where we can go into some more depth and come up with some plans, some proposals, some directions for research and for practice in that area. And as I said, this webinar has been one of a series of webinars we are doing in preparation for our Transportation Symposium in 2021. So stay tuned. And I want to thank you all. First of all, thank the panelists for their contributions. I want to thank the Association of Professional Engineers for partnering with us, Marketing and Communications for their support in terms of the platform. And I want to thank you all panelists who came in and stayed to the end and who posed those very interesting questions. There is going to be a link in terms of the recording for this session, so that if you missed it out on anything, you can get some more details. And we are going to be trying to answer all the questions which we were not able to answer, because we would have your contact information, right? And it will be posted on our symposium blog as well. Thanks again to the moderators, Young, Jared, and Nicola, to our bright young former students who did a fantastic job in supporting the whole process. Thank you all, folks, and looking forward to seeing you. Remember, we do have a special session, a webinar next week, Thursday, Gender Equality in Engineering. That is an interesting topic. Gender Equality in Engineering, and that is on Thursday, December the 3rd, from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. We'll be sending out a flyer on that. Look for it, and we hope you can join us then. Till then, have a good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for coming. Bye for now.